Hello, I'm concluding this year's horror month with a retrospective on the Hellraiser franchise, and I'm joined by college professor and author William Burns.
Hello, everyone.
Now, Hellraiser, I think the first Hellraiser movie is a great standalone film. It's honestly, I think, one of the greatest horror films ever made, but as a franchise, I don't think it should have ever been a franchise. It was a great standalone film, but as a franchise, this is honestly one of the weaker horror franchises out there. But what do you think of Hellraiser as a franchise before we get into the individual films?
Yeah, I agree with you, Christian. I think it is one of the worst horror franchises because I think that each subsequent film has watered down the original philosophy, the ferocity, the transgressive ideas that you saw, particularly in the first one and to a certain degree in the second one. So with each film, it became exactly what I think Barker did not want it to become. Formulaic horror.
And I think one of the biggest mistakes they made with this franchise was making Pinhead the main villain. Now, I've known about Pinhead way before I've seen any of the movies. Like, he is one of the great horror icons, but earlier in the series, he was never meant to be the be-all, end-all of the series, and I think making him this slasher villain was very detrimental to the storyline of the series.
Well, yeah, I agree with you what you're saying about how Pinhead should not have become the sort of standard Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers-esque kind of killer, right? He was more of, especially in the first film, he was more of a metaphor. He was a metaphor for, pain and pleasure and the sort of ecstasy of emotions, of feeling the sort of the extremes of these emotions. So to take that again, and it's watered down, to take something that has so much potential in terms of ideas, in terms of philosophy, in terms of exploring the sort of extremes of behavior, it becomes a watered down cliche that you see in pretty much any other horror film.
So we'll start off talking about the original Hellraiser. Came out in 1987, was written and directed by horror and fantasy author Clive Barker, and was based on his 1986 book, The Hellbound Heart. Now, before The Hellbound Heart, he had already made a name for himself in the field of horror literature with his 6-volume anthology, The Books of Blood, which got Stephen King to famously call him the future of horror fiction. Now, before we talk about the movie, have you read the book or have read anything by Clive Barker?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was, again, being a teenage horror fan in the 1980s, Clive Barker was such, almost like, I imagine, like, sort of how the punk rock bands sort of just blew up everything that you ever expected about music in the late 70s and early 80s. I think Clive Barker really did that in the mid-80s to late 80s in terms of horror. So I was very much aware of Clive Barker. Actually, I became aware of him through reading Swamp Thing, Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. I remember one of the issues, Abby Arkane is in bed reading one of the Books of Blood. So seeing that, I became intrigued by that. I remember going to the bookstore, like Walden Books, one of those old chains, and that you used to have in malls, and finding the Books of Blood and buying the 3 that they had there, and then getting out from the library. I believe it was called In the Flesh, or yeah. I guess for the last 2 volumes, they decided to change the names for the American public. But I remember just being fascinated by the stories. The stories were they were funny, but they also were horrific. They had a totally different viewpoint in terms of the gay, more homosexual sort of perspective in it. It really just totally blew my mind and really changed how I felt about horror.
It's funny that you mentioned Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, because I was listening to an interview with Stephen Bissett, and he talked about how when those books first came out, Alan Moore called him up saying, "Steve, you have to read this new author, Clive Barker."
Absolutely. That doesn't surprise me at all, because I think that, maybe in a different way, but Alan Moore, Clive Barker, Steve Bissett, John Tottleman, all those guys, I think really were looking to shake up horror. They really were looking to sort of upend a lot of the tropes that had become so ingrained in horror that they became almost like normalized, almost accepted that they were going to be in horror. And then Alan Moore, Clive Barker, these kind of new voices came in, and they just totally just ripped everything apart, I remember reading a review one time talking about the first Ramones album, how the effect of the first Ramones album was like a boulder falling on a box of cream donuts. And then I just think of the same thing with Clive Barker and people and Alan Moore. That's what it was. Horror had become this very safe, very sort of, soft, genre, which really wasn't pushing any boundaries anymore, became very conservative. And then you had, again, somebody like Alan Moore, and specifically, more importantly, somebody like Clive Barker, who just hit it like an atom bomb going off.
In Stephen King's initial review of Books of Blood, he said that the stuff that Clive Barker was doing made the rest of us, and by us he meant other people in the horror writers community, look like we've been asleep for the past 10 years. Which I think is really interesting, because as much as I love Stephen King, I think compared to Stephen King, there's a real philosophy to Clive Barker's work that really separates him and elevates him from a lot of other horror writers like Stephen King, Dean Koontz, or Robert McCammon.
Very much so. I think, for me, the thing that really was the most shocking and the most provocative aspect of Clive Barker was his willingness to get into sexual transgression. I think that was one of the things that was hinted at in a lot of horror, but until Barker came along, it was not something that was a sustained theme or a sustained approach to horror. Even if you look at Stephen King, Stephen King talks about sex, but it is largely, heterosexual, normal, kind of, whatever normal is, but this heterosexual norm of sexuality. Whereas Barker just came in and just sort of explored so many different aspects of sexuality that made his work so compelling.
Now, for a movie that's written and directed by the same person who wrote the book, the film's actually quite different than the source material. For example, in the book, the character of Larry is called Rory in the book, and the character of Kirsty is not his daughter. In the book, she's actually a friend of Rory around his same age, and she's actually in love with him in the book. What do you think of those differences and the changes that Barker made when he made it into a movie?
Well, I think he improved on all aspects of that. I think The Hellbound Heart, it's a really good story, but Hellraiser is just like, an amazing film. And he just sort of elevated, I think, the ability to be able to explore more of the fetishes, explore more of the transgressiveness in a film, with the visuals in a film, really elevated Barker's game. It really did. I think sort of words, he's an amazing wordsmith, but when all of a sudden he was able to add in visuals, he was able to sort of add in music, he was able to add in, this incredible emotional, the emotional stakes that come out of any kind of relationship, especially sexual relationships. I think that's really where he came into his own. I remember quite clearly, this is in 1987. Horror was not exactly in, not at its zenith, or wasn't sort of in an upswing. It actually was in a sort of, I think, a real sort of valley. It was really sort of, horror films that were coming out were not, you had sort of the franchising of horror. So, but being a horror fan, I went to go see every Freddy movie that came out, every Jason movie that came out. It was just, for me, it was a very sort of, except for the films of John Carpenter, it was not a very exciting time for horror. And I remember seeing TV commercials for Hellraiser, and the TV commercials made it look like another Freddy, another Jason. Pinhead was this killer. And I was like, all right, well, it kind of looks interesting. I'm going to go see it. And I remember going to see it and just having my mind blown, because I went in with such a different expectation, and that expectation was just totally ripped out of my mind. And seeing it in the movie theater, I was like shocked that it was something that was so sophisticated, that was so mature, was being done in the horror genre. It was just something, I think the horror genre had become very infantilized, had become very juvenile, very much directed towards teenagers, because I guess they were the ones going to the movies, spending all the money, so that's who the films were sort of directed towards. But seeing this movie that was so mature, that was about sexual relationships, that was about desire, and was about sort of pain and pleasure, and sort of, all these kind of very intellectual, very mature themes and concepts was totally mind-blowing to me. I was like, wow, this is what horror can do. This is something that we have to get back to. So I loved it. I remember seeing it. My mind was just blown. I was so excited to see something that was what I always wanted to see out of a horror film.
Yeah, and I actually think it's really unfair that this film nowadays is kind of lumped in with a lot of the 80s slasher films like Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street, even though I do think the first Nightmare on Elm Street is a little deeper than people have given it credit for. this is not a slasher film. This is not a slasher film at all, but I think it's unfair that it's kind of been lumped in with a lot of slasher films. But it has a lot of deeper themes, and I actually think it's a very subversive film. It's very much about sexuality and sexual desensitization, and even sexual repression to a certain extent.
Well, horror should be subversive. I think that's one of the great sort of potentialities of horror, is that it could subvert these things. It attacks them. It overtakes them. It flips over what our expectations are. And that's why I think this film is such a masterpiece, and why it stood the test of time, because that's what it does. And I think a lot of these things that Barker was dealing with in this film still have not been adequately addressed in our society. And this is 30 30 years afterwards, and they still have not been adequately addressed in our society. If anything, it's been the opposite. We've kind of gone for, even though the society might be more explicit in some things in terms of discussing these things and having intellectual conversations about them, I think it's actually gone the other way.
And you could really talk about the themes of sexual desensitization with Frank, because Frank is somebody who you get the idea has dabbled in just about every sexual perversion you could think of, and yet he's still unsatisfied. He needs that next fix, essentially, if you want to make a drug parallel. That's why he seeks out the Cenobites, is because he's looking for that ultimate pleasure, and of course the Cenobites end up giving him a lot more than he bargained for. But I think there's a really interesting character analysis with Frank there. I think
that Frank is a very Sadian character. I think this film is very much, even though it's funny because this is something that would be picked up in one of the sequels, but I think that Hellraiser has very much was influenced by the Marquis de Sade and his sort of philosophies and his ideas about sexuality. So again, it's a very sort of mature, very intellectual sort of approach to sexuality.
I'm a big fan of the band Tool, and they have a song off of their album Edema called Stinkfist, which honestly seems to be about some of the themes that we're talking about here. Like, there are lines in that song like, "Constant overstimulation numbs me, boredom's not a burden anyone should bear," or "I'll keep digging till I feel something." I doubt Maynard actually wrote the song about Hellraiser, but it sounds like it was written about the character of Frank. And the music video for that song is honestly very Hellraiser-esque.
Very much so. Well, again, talking about music, I think you can't get away from the influence of the band Coil on Clive Barker and on this film. I think that a lot of the issues that we've been talking about sexuality, about transgression, about the transformative power of pain and pleasure, really came out of a lot of the work that Coil, John Balance, and Peter Christopherson were doing. Clive Barker, of course, was friends with them through his relationship with Stephen Thrower, who was also in the band at the time as well. And I've always wanted to ask Clive Barker if the imagery of the Cenobites, specifically Pinhead, came out of Coil's interest in body modification, in piercing, which at the time, you have to remember, at the time in the early 80s in England was illegal. So if you went to a tattoo artist and they pierced your body, the tattoo artist could actually be arrested. So it was very transgressive. Any kind of piercings, any kind of body modification was still very transgressive in England. So I'm wondering if that sort of fed into Clive Barker's sort of imagery, the sort of the ideas that he had for this film.
It's funny that you mention that, because I don't know if you've ever seen the music video for Coil's version of Tainted Love.
Absolutely.
But that music video, it feels very Hellraiser-esque.
Mm-hmm. And also, too, of course, Coil did the original soundtrack for Hellraiser. And then when it got picked up for distribution, I believe, by, what was it? Was it Dimension? or
No, New World Pictures. Dimension didn't exist at this point.
They thought that they didn't think that the soundtrack was appropriate, so that's when they brought in Christopher Young, right? Mm-hmm. But if you listen, the Coil have subsequently released their versions of the songs that were going to be in the film. So again, that's another connection with Coil with Hellraiser. And the music that Coil came up with was amazing. And I think Clive Barker, he had a quote about Coil saying that Coil is the only music that made his bowels churn.
One thing I also really love about this movie is there's such an ambiguity to Pinhead and the other Cenobites, where you're really not sure if the Cenobites are actually Satan's demons or are they something else entirely. Like, I think the line, "where angels to some, demons to others," is actually really important. Like, how do we know the Cenobites aren't angels? Like, or what if the religions have got it wrong and maybe God and the devil are a lot closer than we think? Or what if heaven and hell is a point of view thing? What's heaven to one person will be hell to another person.
Yeah, I mean, I agree totally with that. But I also think the other thing that was so transgressive about this film is that traditional accounts of religion have really separated the body from the soul, right? Spirituality was something that was pure. The body was something that was disgusting, that had to be overcome, that had to be rejected. Barker doesn't do that in this film. Barker mixes the two. That you can't separate. I think for Barker, you can't separate the body from the soul. You can't sort of make that sort of very false dichotomy. That sort of these things are intertwined. There's a spirituality to the flesh. There is a sort of a materiality to spirituality that you can't get rid of those things. It's a both and, that we're both spirit and flesh, not one or the other. And in this film, he really sort of shows that with the Cenobites. I think the Cenobites are the perfect sort of embodiment of this idea of how flesh and soul, spirit and material sort of being sort of come together.
Yeah, and one thing I think is interesting, now, this might show that I'm a complete dumbass, but I always thought Cenobite was a word that Clive Barker came up with until I found it in the dictionary and realized that Cenobite actually means the member of, like, a religious order or something. But I think that's really appropriate for these characters that they're called the Cenobites, because they act like they're members of some religious order. Like, Pinhead basically does act as a priest in a lot of ways.
No, absolutely. And that's another thing I really like about this film, is that a lot of horror films, I think, really they sort of validate the Judeo-Christian kind of, God is good, devil is bad kind of thing. And this film just totally throws that out. Yeah. It sort of says that, there's got to be some other ways of thinking about religion than just your Judeo-Christian tropes that we've become so used to in Western civilization.
Yeah, at the same time, it doesn't really contradict those, because I think a lot of it is left to the viewer's interpretation. One way I kind of look at it is the only reason the characters are calling the Cenobites demons is because that's the only thing they know to call them. How do we know the Cenobites aren't just beings from another dimension, but, humans are just interpreting them as demons?
No, absolutely. And I guess that's where you can connect this to Lovecraft, right? The work of Lovecraft, right? Of that human beings have such a narrow frame of reference. We're so insignificant. We're so ignorant of the larger sort of, goings on of the universe, that's all we can do. That we can only see this immensity through a very narrow reference point. And it just happens to be, obviously, the reference point for us, for people in the Western world, is Judeo-Christian, iconography or beliefs.
Now, what do you think of the character of the Vagabond? Now, I've always assumed that the Vagabond was supposed to be the devil or something, if you want to interpret a Judeo-Christian mythology to it, which, as I said, the mythology of the film is very much left ambiguous. But in the book, there's a character called the Engineer, who you get the idea is actually the one pulling the Cenobite strings. I always assumed that the Vagabond is supposed to be the Engineer. Like, it seems like he's the one who is sort of manipulating all of this, but I know there are Hellraiser comics that explain what these Vagabonds actually are.
Well, I should say, the first time I saw the movie, I thought it was Alan Moore. I swear to God, I thought that was Alan Moore playing the character, so it got me even more excited, But I found out, of course, it wasn't Alan Moore. But I always thought that he was sort of reminded me of kind of a wandering Jew figure, like this sort of ageless kind of character that sort of just, wanders through and sort of knows about the Cenobites, knows these things, but the knowledge is damned him in some ways. I think that's another thing that we see in Hellraiser, is how a little knowledge could be a dangerous thing. And like what happens with Kirsty, right? Her knowledge of the Cenobites, right, kind of dooms her for the first and second films in some ways. So that's what I took him to be, this kind of wandering, kind of, like I said, like a wandering Jew figure that in some ways maybe is punished or has been rewarded, either, again, going back to the both and, maybe he's punished and rewarded to sort of, just wander across and witness these things, and that his knowledge of the larger workings of, the Cenobites and sort of whatever Barker's worldview is, kind of dooms him, but also raises him at the same time.
This might seem like a weird comparison, but I actually think you could very much compare Hellraiser to David Cronenberg's Videodrome. In a lot of ways, the journey that Frank goes on is not all that different from the journey that Max Wren goes on in Videodrome, but I don't know what you think of that.
I never thought, to be honest, I never made that connection, but yeah, I think that's a brilliant connection. I think that the transformation of both characters is really important in the film, right? In either films, right? Whereas Max Wren's transformation, is kind of open-ended. We don't know exactly what's going to happen to him at the end of the movie. Obviously, Frank sort of dooms him. But again, Frank and Max Wren are both people who are looking to be oversaturated, right? Sort of
overstimulated.
Oh, yes, thank you. Overstimulated, and what the results of that are. So yeah, that's an interesting comparison. I never thought of that.
And you could even compare the Nikki Brand character from Videodrome to the Cenobites in a lot of ways.
That's a good. Yeah, that sort of lures him in. That sort of tempts him. Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think of, besides Frank, of course, what do you think of the other characters in the film, like Larry, Kirsty, and Julia?
Oh, I think they're great. I think they're well-drawn characters. They're not cliches at all. But to me, the really fascinating character is Julia. She's the most fascinating character in the film. Maybe outside of Frank, but Julia is just because you see, whereas Frank sort of starts the film, he's already been transformed in some ways. When you first meet Frank, he's already going down his road, We're not really sure about Julia. So we actually get to see Julia actually go down that road of pleasure, of desire. So to me, Julia is the most interesting character. And I think the performance of
Claire Higgins.
Right. Her performance is excellent in the film. And Andrew Robinson is great. They're all really good.
Oh,
I think they're
Andrew
really good.
Robinson's amazing in this
Absolutely.
movie. But especially
especially when he becomes Frank, right? And then that, to me, that really shows what a talented actor he is, because his mannerisms, his body language, everything sort of changes, but not explicitly, but he does it very subtly.
Yeah.
And I think his performance is excellent. But my favorite character in the whole film is Julia.
I can see that. One thing I wanted to talk about is the Cenobites. I think a lot of people mistake the Cenobites for being the villains of the film, but they're really not if you really stop to think about it. I mean, Frank and Julia, they're the villains of the film. If anything, the Cenobites, I would almost say, are more anti-heroes than anything else.
Well, I mean, the Cenobites stopped Frank.
Yeah.
Right? They stopped Frank. I agree with you. Julia and Frank are the villains in the film. The Cenobites are just like this sort of immoral, above good and evil type of beings, right? That sort of, they're observers, and they only intervene, right, when they're called. Which I think is really interesting too. But yeah, I agree with you. The Cenobites are, and that's another thing that I think is really radical for horror, to have monsters, which, I guess we could call the Cenobites monsters, not be the evil ones, not be the ones that are sort of the catalyst for the horror, right? And that's one of the things I think that we see in a lot of Clive Barker's work, right? Especially Nightbreed. I think Nightbreed is a film that he really sort of brings that idea to the fore, that monsters don't have to be evil. Monsters might be outsiders, but that doesn't necessarily make them evil. If anything, it might even make them more sympathetic, more empathetic, because they are outsiders.
This is my friend Chris giving his thoughts on the original Hellraiser.
So starting off with the original, it has a place kind of close to my heart because it's the first horror movie I ever saw. And I remember being just so taken by the visuals of it. I think that's what's so enamoring about Clive's work, is the stuff he comes up with is just insane. These visions of hell and demons, it's crazy. Pinhead is such a frightening character just to look at, and I think the thing that is so off-putting about him is just how articulate he is, how straightforward he is, how conversational and almost pleasant he is to talk to, as much as he's threatening and talking about horrific shit. He's a good conversationalist, is the odd thing about him. That's what's so amazing about Clive's work. It's so imaginative, despite the fact that it's horrific and crazy to read and frightening. That's what I always liked about him, because I feel like out of all the authors, and this is probably controversial to say, he's probably the one that you could point out as true horror, at least in my opinion, because it's kind of unrelenting and without mercy, and pretty damn scary. It doesn't hold back. It's very in your face, but at the same time, you're also taken with just how out there all the shit is. The idea of a puzzle box that summons demons, and all this sadomasochistic subtext, and I think the character of Frank is sort of an interesting dichotomy of the line between good and evil, because he's really not evil as you would think somebody is. He's more just a really sadistic fuck who is crafty and resourceful, you know, to the point where he is able to escape demons you're never, ever supposed to walk away from. So I love that whole third act where he's wearing his brother's skin and all this stuff. It's really crazy, the whole, like, last 20 minutes of that movie. It definitely is one of my favorite horror films. And I think the reason people like it so much is just how well it holds up, even today. Even much as it's like, it's kind of old and the production value is much different than it would be today, but it's just still so fun to watch and so interesting and crazy. And I always enjoy it every single time. And I always find something different in it every single time. And that's what the best stories and the best movies do for you.
Now I would like to introduce Esley Greer, who's known as Entertainment Fanatic Reviews here on YouTube, and I've contributed to one of his videos a few months ago, and I wanted him to take part in this video. So these are his thoughts on the first Hellraiser movie and on the franchise overall. Now his segment on the first Hellraiser film is much shorter than Chris's, but he originally sent this to me as just one video where he's listing off each film in the franchise, and I don't think he realized that I was going to be chopping this up into different segments. But I hope you enjoy his thoughts on the first Hellraiser movie, and I'll leave a link to his channel in the description below.
Before I get into this video, I want to thank Christian Dorr from Canto 1408 for letting me take part in this video. Been watching his channel for about 3 or 4 years, and he's a really cool dude, and he's been on my channel a few times, and I really appreciate it. So, there's 10 films in the series, I believe, and this series has been known to go, you know, from great quality to just straight up shit. And some of these films are just so bad they're good. If you're into those type of films, you might enjoy these films. So we're gonna talk about Hellraiser. Should you check it out? Yes. The only thing that I don't really like about this film is that Pinhead is not in this film as much as I'd like for him to be, but it's a great story nonetheless, and you should definitely check it out.
So, in 1988, we got the sequel to Hellraiser, Hellbound, Hellraiser II, which was directed by Tony Rendell, who would go on to direct the movie Ticks, and he also produced The Return of Godzilla when it came over to America as Godzilla 1985. Now, this is a movie that's really had to grow on me over time. I did not like it when I first saw it. Over the years, it's really grown on me, and now I don't think it's better than the original. I don't think it's as good as the original, but I think it's the only one of the sequels that is actually worthy of the original. But what do you think of this movie?
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it very much. I remember could not wait for it to come out. I remember when it came out, but I agree. I don't think it's as intellectually deep as the first film. But I think it's one of those things. I think that I was almost relieved of that when I saw it in the movie theater, because I couldn't imagine a movie being more harrowing, more transgressive than the original Hellraiser. But I really enjoyed it. And one of the things I really liked was I think it really expanded on the imagery that was introduced in the first film. So to me, I really loved the look of the film. Like, I loved Leviathan. I thought that was a great idea. I love that deep, like, bass sound that Leviathan sort of emits, you know. I really love the character of Dr. Chenard. I thought his obsession with the lament configuration and all this was really brilliant, you know. And even the little insights you got into Pinhead's sort of past, I think were good. I think they kind of went off the deep end with that in the third and the other ones. But I like seeing those, like, just little bits, and it really sort of encouraged you to sort of fill in the blanks yourself with your imagination. But again, I really enjoyed the sequel. I don't think it is as transgressive or as groundbreaking as the first film, but I agree with you. I think it's a worthy sequel.
One thing I really love about this movie is it expands upon the mythology. Like, you actually get to see the world that the Cenobites are from, but it still leaves a lot of it ambiguous. Like Leviathan, which is actually something taken from the Bible, but in the Bible, Leviathan is like a sea creature. In this, he's the god of hell, but you're not sure if he's Satan, or more so maybe where we got the idea of Satan from, or again, that whole idea that heaven and hell is a point of view kind of thing. What if he's actually God? You know, like, there is something very Lovecraftian about Leviathan as well. Like, you almost get the idea that he's neither good or evil, but the human characters are kind of projecting their views onto it.
Yeah, I agree. I was very impressed with the mythology, and I agree with you. I like the fact that they gave you glimpses, but they didn't come out and explain everything to you. I hate that about not just horror films, but any films. I hate sort of being explained these things. I like to sort of try to figure out myself, or to sort of sort of just like riff on what it could be. But I agree with you. I thought that the imagery, I thought that the ideas of the film were really great, and they were in line with the first film. They were not sort of in contradiction to the first film. I think they very much were in line with the first film. And again, I agree with you in terms of the Lovecraftian aspect, and it's funny because I think a lot of times when people say films are Lovecraftian, they only look at the imagery in the film and they don't look at the ideas of the philosophy. And I haven't really read too much of Hellraiser films being considered Lovecraftian, but absolutely, if you look at the ideas, absolutely. Okay, granted, they don't have, there's kind of monsters, but they have not like tentacles. And I think a lot of times that becomes a cliche about Lovecraft, right? Lovecraft films are mostly judged on their imagery and not on their philosophy. And these two films, I think, absolutely have that philosophy. Maybe even in the sequel, even more so than in the first film.
Now, in the film, as you alluded to, you do find out where the Cenobites came from. You find out that they were actually humans at one point, and a way that makes the whole calling it hell and calling themselves demons makes sense because they were once human. It's like demons and hell is the only thing they know to call themselves, Yeah,
absolutely. And again, I think the way they did it in the film makes it sort of very much falls in line with the first film. I love like the opening parts where you see like the guy who would become Pinhead. You sort of understand sort of where he's coming from, but you don't get the whole story, And I think that's really a brave choice to do, to sort of say to the audience, figure it out yourself, or think about it for yourself, rather than us having to explain every little thing to you.
Now, what do you think of Julia in the film? Because in this one, she really does become the main villain.
I mean, I love Julia. I love the character. But I do think she becomes a little cartoony in this film, where her performance was much more nuanced than the first film. But I love Julia. I love the character. I loved her and all the bandages. I love, I love the character. But I would have to say, I think it's a little bit more cartoony in this one than in the first film.
And speaking of cartoony, there are some cheesy moments in the film, like when Dr. Channard becomes a Cenobite. Some of his one-liners I thought were really cheesy.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the things that I really don't like about some of the other films in this franchise, when they try to bring in new Cenobites, and it just does not work. Have the four, they're almost like, even though they're humans, it's almost like they're universal. They've always been around. It's like an interesting kind of condition that they have. It's
almost like they're just avatars for some much older force.
Absolutely. So when you bring in, Cenobites with like CDs coming out of them, or like cameras and things, it just totally ruins it.
Save that for the third one. I actually kind of disagree with you about just leaving it as the four, because I feel like at the end of this film, their arcs were over. Like, it was kind of implied that they died, they turned into humans again, and then they died. The fact that they died, that should have been the end of these Cenobites, because again, Pinhead was never meant to be the be-all, end-all of this series. Actually, Clive Barker originally wanted Julia to be the continuing character throughout all these movies.
Right. And then I don't even know if that would have been worked as well. I think that the movie series should have ended with the second one, and that would have been a perfect way to sort of to finish telling the story.
So Hellbound is a strange beast, because I think it's pure escalation, but it's also dipping its toes into many different waters. Like, okay, we're continuing the story of the first one. We're going to make Julia the villain. We're going to explore all that. But we're also going to pull a Frank and have him be... We're going to have like a side villain who is the Doctor. Which is a cool sort of like 1-2 punch. And like Frank, he's also another interesting character who's intrigued and finds power in all these discoveries that he makes over the course of the film. So it's almost kind of the same degree what's going on with Frank, where Frank was like a sadist who is looking for the unattainable. This guy is in the same league as that. And I love that it takes place in a sanitarium, or just in a hospital in general, because it's not where you'd expect the sequel to go, to this like isolated place. And I like it a lot because of that. But I think Julia really steps up to the plate as a villain, and I love her performance in it. And again, it has the same problems as the first one because it's kind of set back by the fact that it's got a low production value, unfortunately, especially with all the CG and stuff. But I think it's still pretty glorious to watch, just for what they were getting away with these movies at the time. You still feel Clive's sort of mark on it, unlike everything that came after this. This still feels very much Clive. But I think it does what a good sequel does, which is complement the first one very well, but also work well on its own. And when you kind of step back, you see that it's two separate stories telling one giant story. And I just love the concept of the Pillar of Souls and kind of throwing crazy people into the mix or invalid people into the mix and seeing how they react to all this frightening stuff like the puzzle box and the Cenobites. They really could have done anything with this first one, with the second one. And it was an interesting choice to do a hospital. But I think it worked out really well because it made the sequel distinct and intriguing and much more fun to watch, and a very different movie from the first one.
So, Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. I don't know why it's called Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. It should have just been called Hellraiser 2, Hellbound. But I understand about Clive Barker's novel and everything. But this is my favorite in the franchise. Has a really nice dark tone in this film, and it has a great cast, some cool effects, and Pinhead. You get some more backstory on Pinhead, which is really cool.
Now we move on to Hellraiser III: Hell on Earth, which was released in 1992. This was the first of the series to be produced by Miramax. Miramax, of course, is a company started by Bob Weinstein and his brother Harvey Penis Hands. Now, Miramax, more specifically Dimension, which was also a Weinstein company, would own this franchise from here on out. Now, they only produced it. I think Paramount distributed this one, or at least I know Paramount distributed all the home releases of this movie. Now, I first saw this movie on TV when I was 12 years old. I actually saw it before I even saw the first two. And now, at 12, you'll buy a lot of shit, but I hated this movie at 12. So you could bet your ass I hate this movie now. What this is, if it wasn't for the fact that there are several Hellraiser movies after this I hate more, I would say this is the worst of the franchise, and I would say, technically speaking, it probably is the worst of the franchise. What do you think of Hellraiser?
Well, I agree with you as well. I saw it on opening night when it came out because I was so excited to see it, and I think I've rarely been more disappointed in seeing a film. It's a mess. It's a film that sort of takes all the greatness of the first film and, to a lesser extent, the greatness of the second film, and just totally ruins it, and just totally has cliched characters, takes away all the philosophy, and just leaves the explicitness and not even interesting explicitness. It's a mess of a movie, and it really sort of ruins a lot of the momentum I think the first two films really sort of gained for this franchise.
Yeah, and then, the fact that you have Pinhead just turning people into Cenobites right then and there, the camera Cenobite, the CD Cenobites, are you freaking kidding me?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, And again, I think that, to me, the worst part about this film, the story is pretty bad, but the worst part of the film is the acting is terrible, except for, Terry Farrell?
Yeah.
She's good, but the acting in this movie is so bad. The characters are just such cliches, 90s cliches, like the clubs and this, some of the imagery, I think, of, the tower in the film and things, like the statue or that tower and thing, it's not bad, and something could have been done with that, but yeah, it takes everything that was special about Hellraiser and just turns it into, a cliched, sort of boring, just a mess of horror tropes that just do not hang together at all.
I will say, though, in the movie's defense, there are some interesting ideas, like the whole thing with the person that Pinhead was when he was human, this idea that his spirit is still there and he's trying to stop his other self. That was kind of an interesting concept.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought that was cliche too. I'd seen it before and done better. So, and that was one of the things that what I loved about the Hellraiser movies was things I'd never seen before in a horror film. Everything in this film is something that I've seen before already.
Yeah, because basically what they did was, this is the first one that I would say is a slasher film. They turned Pinhead into a slasher villain in this one, and I think that was a mistake. Now, what's funny is this one is actually written by Peter Akins, who wrote Hellraiser 2. It's just hard to believe that the person who wrote Hellraiser 2 also wrote this one. I don't know if maybe there was studio interference or
I think so. I think Miramax messed with almost all of the sequels. I think they had something to say about everything, and they just ruined this. It took something that was so special and so amazing and turned it into something that was so routine, so rote, so boring. And it just shows you how sort of studios can totally ruin something that is creative and that has revolutionary potential.
So Hell on Earth is going to be a short one, because I think it's a very straightforward movie compared to the first two. It's sort of just them going, okay, we're going to sort of just have Pinhead try to take over and have that be it, even though that kind of goes against the whole concept of the first two movies. Mainly just because we want to keep this franchise going and we don't really know where to take it. I like the idea of Elliot becoming separate from Pinhead and those two sides of the same coin sort of warring. That's pretty cool. Duality is something I've always been attracted to in storytelling and in general, so that speaks to me. I guess you can see them still trying to follow in Clive's footsteps. You still get like little sadomasochistic stuff. That sex scene in particular is something you would totally see in a Clive story as it is. But beyond that, it doesn't really leave you with much other than just seeing shit get fucked up. I appreciate like Kirsty's cameo and the throwbacks to the previous ones, but as much as it is enjoyable to watch, it's just not on the same level as the first two. It's just sort of made for the sake of being made. I like it. It's a good watch, but it's just nothing that I'm crazy about,
So another one you should check out is Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, which is a lot different from the previous two films, but you get to learn about Pinhead when he was Elliot Spencer. You get flashback scenes with Elliot Spencer, and you get more Pinhead in here, which you can never go wrong with that. But it's really cheesy, but I really do like it.
So now we move on to Hellraiser Bloodline, the fourth film in the series, and this is the one that, of all of them, probably had the most troubled production. This is an Alan Smithee film. For those of you who don't know, Alan Smithee is sort of a shared pseudonym that many directors used to use. Like if a director wanted to have their name taken off of a movie, they just say directed by Alan Smithee. The film is actually directed by Kevin Yeager. I've never really known how to say his last name right. He's the same guy who designed the puppet for Chucky in the Child's Play movies, and he also designed the puppet for the Crypt Keeper in Tales from the Crypt. But additional footage was shot by Joe Chappelle, who also directed Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers. This is honestly, to me, a pretty interesting one. Now, I've seen the work print of this movie. I've seen the theatrical version, of course, but there is a work print that you could find at conventions that is actually quite different than the movie that was released. I don't think it's a great movie, but I think it's an interesting film, and I do not think it's as bad as people have made it out to be. I honestly do think, had Kevin Yeager been allowed to make the movie he wanted to make, this movie would be spoken about in a much higher regard today. It might not be loved necessarily, but I think people would be looking at this movie in a much different light. But what do you think of this one?
Well, I agree with you. I think out of all the sequels besides the second one, it is my favorite, because I do agree with you. I think the ideas, there is some return to some of the ideas from the first two films. I like the idea of the different time frames of, being in 18th century France and then, having the aspect of being in space. So I like that. I thought it did bring something new to the ideas that we have seen in these films. And it wasn't a sort of a cliche that we'd have seen with the third one.
Even both cuts of the movie that I've seen, there are some pacing issues, though, like the way the stuff taking place in 18th century France plays out, and the way that the stuff taking place in present day plays out, and the stuff taking place in space plays out. They're They almost feel like they should have been 3 separate movies, and I almost feel like, and maybe this would have been way too ambitious for the time, I almost feel like this should have been like some kind of trilogy, like 3 separate movies that all connect to each other, set in the Hellraiser universe, but maybe that would have been way too ambitious for the time.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. I mean, for me, the most interesting parts of the film were the 18th century France, because again, I think they think that this film really picks up on de Sade, right? The Sadian kind of themes that were implicit in the first film, at least. So I thought it was really interesting. I thought of that part of how the element configuration was built and sort of what it was built for. I thought that was, to me, was the most intriguing parts of the film, even though I really liked also the space stuff, because to be honest, I had never even considered the idea of Hellraiser in space. But I think that the film does a good job with it.
The idea of Hellraiser in space, in a lot of ways, the movie Event Horizon is almost what a Hellraiser in space should have been.
I agree. I think, well, I would say that I like Event Horizon, but again, I don't think if Clive Barker had done a Hellraiser in space, that would have been really, really fascinating. You know, I think that Event Horizon, like I said, I think it's a good movie, but I don't think it pushes the boundaries of horror the way that maybe Barker would have done if he had done a similar film to that.
Now, Bloodline is a different story from Hell on Earth, because I feel like a lot of people are sort of polarized on this one. Personally, I really like it, and I think it's because I love the nonlinear aspect. I love they take a Pinhead to space, but it's not cheesy. I think they did a good job at that. And there's some bits in it that are really horrifying. You know, like when the twin Cenobite become a triplet. You know, that's a really frightening thing to watch. And I like the idea of sort of tracking them across the ages and seeing the effect they've had on one particular character and just on the timeline in general and where they go in the future. And again, just like the tiny explorations that you see now into Pinhead's character. I really like the way it ends, frankly. I like that as like this definitive ending of Pinhead. Obviously, I think a lot of people would consider kind of the true ending to be whatever Clive wrote in Scarlet Gospels with the Hell Priest and all that. But there's kind of a great thing at the end of him just accepting his fate and just dealing with the fact that he lost. And that great last word, him just going, Amen. You know, it's the great irony of a demon saying that. But beyond that, it's just a really fun watch. You know, not like Hell on Earth, which was kind of fun just for the sake of being fun. This is different. This is a lot more engaging and a lot more investing. I think it really is the structure that helps it a lot, but also that aspect of, you know, bouncing back and forth between genres, you know, in one movie. We're doing sort of sci-fi, sort of horror. We're still getting that, you know, supernatural and sexual undercurrent that Clive would inevitably do anyway. But it's an interesting beast of a movie, and I really like it. I think probably out of all the sequels after 2, this is definitely the one that I would watch, like at the drop of a hat, you know. And what's weird is this seems to be the one that always gets rerun out of like all the sequels that came after 2. It seems like everybody's got a preference for this one, as much as like some people think it's ridiculous and some people, you know, really enjoy it. So if I'm going to say anything for the movies that come after it, I like that each movie wore a different face. I enjoy that they didn't leave a whole lot of pages unturned with this franchise. They did a lot of different things with it. But at the end of the day, it did kind of feel like they were throwing darts at the wall rather than really trying to do good storytelling. Whether they did or not, I guess, is up to you. But you can't deny that it is an effortlessly watchable franchise. And it's a good time, you know. Whether or not these ideas appeal to you or whether you're repulsed by them, they are interesting movies, first and foremost, and horrifying movies, first and foremost. And that is a good thing, believe it or not. So, yeah, I have a soft spot in my heart for the franchise, as kind of hit and miss as it can be. But I definitely do recommend it. It's not for the faint of heart, but give it a watch if you're in for something different or you just want to see some weird shit.
So next up is Hellraiser Bloodline. Should you check it out? Yeah, it's Hellraiser in space, but it's about as good as you'd think. And I do have a action figure of Angelique right there. Really cool piece, one of my favorites in my collection.
Now we move on to Hellraiser Inferno, the fifth film in the series, released in 2000, and this was released straight to video when it came out. From here on out, all the other Hellraiser movies are released straight to video. Honestly, you said how Hellraiser Bloodline was your favorite of the sequels besides 2. This one might actually be my favorite of the sequels besides 2. Like, it's not a great movie, but I actually do kind of like this one, although it really shouldn't have been a Hellraiser movie, because originally this was a standalone horror script, and I think Dimension owned the rights to the script, and they just sort of shoehorned Pinhead and the Cenobites into the script. But I thought it was an interesting idea, albeit it's a little bit of a ripoff of, like, Angel Heart and Jacob's Ladder, but I liked Inferno personally, and it has Craig Schaefer, who I think is a very underrated actor, who does actually have a Clive Barker connection because he was in Nightbreed. What do you think of this one?
I think it's okay. I'm not crazy about it. I think that Angel Heart and Jacob's Ladder did it much better. So I think, to me, it's almost like a watered down version of those films. And I think it kind of gets away from the philosophical, the sort of transgressive things that Clive Barker was trying to do in the first one. So I mean, it's an okay film. I mean, I really don't feel one way or other about it, which I guess is one of the most damning things you could say about a film. But it's okay. I don't think it's horrible. I don't think it totally ruins the sort of the mythos of Hellraiser. But I found it very mediocre.
I can see why you don't like it as much as I do. And again, I don't think it's a great movie, but I think compared to the other sequels, this is probably one of the better ones. I think it's probably the best of all the Hellraiser movies that were originally standalone horror scripts.
Hellraiser Inferno it was one of the first films that was written and wasn't written as a Hellraiser film, but it tries to take a psychological route, and it just fails miserably.
Now we move on to Hellraiser Hellseeker, which came out in 2002. And honestly, this might be my least favorite of the series. Now, the film itself is honestly kind of the same plot as Hellraiser Inferno, but I think Hellraiser Inferno did it much better. But the most insulting aspect of this movie, and the reason I hate this movie so much, is they bring back the character of Kirsty Cotton, once again played by Ashley Lawrence, and what they do with the character, to me, was so freaking insulting to fans of the first two movies. Like, to me, what they did with this character, it was a slap in the face to those first two films, in my opinion. What do you think of Hellraiser Hellseeker?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, it's probably my second least favorite, in terms of the films. But yeah, I agree with you. It's just another film that just, I don't know why it was made. It's poorly executed. The story doesn't really make much sense either. It's a mess of a film, and I don't, and it's really unfortunate that sort of Ashley Lawrence had to be. This is the film she made her come back to the franchise in.
And, like, I remember renting this from Blockbuster once, and the back of the box, like, had the most misleading, like, the back of the box had an entirely different plot than what the movie was. It said that the plot was Kirsty Cotton has to save the world from Pinhead and the Cenobites, and it's like, there's nothing in this movie whatsoever like that. First of all, she's barely even a character in the movie. The movie's actually about her husband in the film, who's played by Dean Winters, who some of you might recognize from the Mayhem commercials. And he's good in the movie for the most part, but overall, I do not like this one, but the main reason I don't like this one is because of what they do to Kirsty. I think it's just, they make her sort of a villain in the film, but then at the end you realize that some of that was just in Dean Winters' head, but it's like, Yeah, she's only really in the beginning and the end of the film. They just brought her back just to bring her back, really. To me, this one is just insulting.
And the next film in the franchise is Hellraiser Hellseeker. The only thing that it has going for it is the return of Ashley Lawrence as Kirsty. But other than that, this movie, oh my god, it is so bad. Don't seek it out. If you could, just look up the scenes with Ashley Lawrence. That's pretty much the only good scenes in here.
Now we come to Hellraiser Deader, the 7th film in the franchise. This was released in 2005. And this one, I'll admit, I haven't seen this movie in about 6 years. I reviewed all the Hellraiser movies back in 2013, and I haven't seen the movie since then. I remember not hating this one, but I found this one to be very mediocre, which in a lot of ways is kind of the worst thing a movie can be. But I honestly don't remember much about this one, and I don't really have a whole lot to say about this one. What do you think of this?
Well, I agree with you what you're saying, that it is kind of mediocre, but I do think that there are some interesting ideas in the film. The cult, there's like a cult built around, the Cenobites and the limited configuration. I thought that was interesting, but again, it's totally the ideas are great, but just the execution of those ideas is really sort of mediocre, very poor. It's even shot, reminded me sort of like a softcore, sex movie or whatever. Kari War is horrible in the movie, of course. And so it really sort of, it takes, again, it's like all the transgressiveness of the first film, and even to an extent the second film, is totally wasted here. The imagery is just so cliched in terms of pleasure and pain, and they don't do anything new with it. If anything, they make things even more stark in terms of the differences between those things, where I think that Barker in the first film was trying to sort of equate those things.
Again, the worst thing I can say about this movie is it's just mediocre.
So next up is one called Hellraiser Deader, and is probably the stupidest title that I've ever heard of, but despite the title, I actually had a good time with it. It has a weird story, and these films are just weird anyway, but I had a good time with it.
Now we come to Hellraiser 8 Hellworld. And this one, it's funny, I would say Hellraiser 3, Hellraiser 6, and this one, they're almost like, to me, those are the 3 worst films in this franchise. This is a bad freaking movie. This movie is really, really, just piss poor, to be quite honest. What do you think of this one?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think one of the things one of the worst aspects of this movie is they totally turned Pinhead into the one-liner killer, cliched, monster in the film. And that, to me, I really thought was the worst part of the film.
Oh, they make him he's absolutely a slasher villain in this one. There's even a scene where he kills somebody with a meat cleaver, for God's sake. Right.
Yeah, and again, I think that's exactly what Clive Barker did not want to turn this character into, and yet this is what he's sort of descended into, and it's a shame. It's to take such a great character and turn it into such a cliche. I think it's one of the worst things you could do to any franchise.
I will say, probably the only good thing about this movie is Lance Henriksen. And Lance Henriksen's good in anything. He's one of those actors who, even when he's in crap, and he's been in a lot of crap, he always brings his A game to it.
That's true. I mean, he's a great actor, so he's always going to give his all, I think. And that, you're right, that's probably the only redeeming quality for this film.
Yeah. But the movie also has this ridiculous twist where it turns out none of it was real, and it was just the kids being buried in Lance Henriksen's backyard or something, and it's like, wow, that's just fucking stupid. And then at the end, it turns out the Cenobites were real because Lance Henriksen's character opens the box and they kill him. This is a bad freaking movie. I remember when I reviewed it, I did a joke where I'm holding up the DVD saying, guys, I was just in the bathroom and this fell out of my ass.
Yeah, I can understand that, absolutely. But yeah, total waste of time.
Next up is Hellraiser Hellworld, which this is considered one of the worst, and I could see why, but it is very meta, self-aware, and in this one, there's a video game that's based off Hellraiser and Pinhead and everybody else, and it's really tongue-in-cheek, it's really goofy, but I like it. It has a young Henry Cavill in it.
Now we move on to Hellraiser 9 Revelations, which was released in 2011. From what I've heard about this movie, this was literally shot in a period of, I want to say, a week. or 2 weeks. Like, this had a very quick production, and this is the first Hellraiser movie where Doug Bradley does not play Pinhead, because apparently he saw the script and wanted nothing to do with it. And I know in some of the advertising they said from the mind of Clive Barker, and Clive Barker responded to that by some Twitter post saying, "This is not from my mind, it's not even from my butthole." I haven't seen this movie since I did the review on it back in 2013. I honestly don't remember shit about this movie. I just remember I did not like it. You haven't seen this one,
No,
right?
I'd given up by this point, actually, with the Hellraiser sequels. I think I was just like, I'm done. After the, Hellworld, I was like, I'm not watching it anymore. It was such an insult to the majesty of the first one that I was like, nope, I'm out.
There's not much I can say about it either. Go check out my review. I think I said more about it in my review of it. Although my review, it was one of the few reviews I did where I also incorporated a skit where like a demon is forcing me to watch the movie or something. But yeah, this one I do not recommend.
So the ninth film in this franchise is probably the worst in the franchise. It's one that I watched once and I'm surprised I got all the way through with, that being Hellraiser Revelations. It is the first appearance without Doug Bradley as Pinhead. Don't check it out.
And then the final film in the Hellraiser franchise, which was released in 2018, was Hellraiser Judgement, which I actually kind of liked. It's not a great movie, but for me it's kind of like Hellraiser Inferno. It's like, it's not a great film, but I still enjoyed it for the most part. What did you think of this one?
No, I wasn't crazy about it. I thought it was another cliched, version of the amazing ideas that Clive Barker did with the first film. I thought that, the blood and the torture, it looked like a bad, goth, industrial video to me. So I was not crazy about the film at all. Like I said, I thought, the one character, one of the Cenobites, is it the engineer or something like that?
No, I don't think he's called the engineer. I know he had some name, but I totally forgot what they called him.
And he's got a German accent, like a Nazi, and he plays like Beethoven. To me, it just was just cliched ideas, and that was the whole point of the first movie, is to break those cliches, to come up with new ideas, new concepts. And this film, to me, it was the same thing I'd seen before.
What do you think of the whole thing where they brought an angel into it? This whole idea that heaven and hell work a lot closer than we think. I thought that was interesting, but at the same time, it kind of misses the point of what we talked about, how we weren't sure if these really were Satan's demons in the first movie. We weren't sure if this really was the traditional Judeo-Christian hell, or if it was something else entirely. So bringing an angel into it, as much as I love stuff that deals with the concept of angels, like the prophecy, it just kind of misses the point of Hellraiser.
Exactly. That's another reason I didn't like this film, is they explained too much. And the explanation wasn't even that interesting. It's been done better in other films. So again, why even bother doing that? And again, I think just flies in the face of what was so groundbreaking, so transgressive of the first film.
So last up in the series is Hellraiser Judgment, and it's one that, if you're not into gore, if you're not into gross stuff, the first 20-30 minutes is not for you, but after that, it picks up, and it's a really good film, and this guy that plays Pinhead does a lot better than the previous guy, and I don't know, just a fun time altogether. So out of the franchise, I can watch and enjoy 7 out of 10 films, which most people can only say they only enjoy 3 or 4 in the franchise, but I like bad movies. So I want to thank Christian Dorr from Canto 1408 for letting me take part in this Hellraiser franchise review, and I'll see you guys in the next collab.
Now, I do want to point out that Clive Barker used the Cenobites again in some of his other books. Like, the Cenobites are actually mentioned in his fantasy novel Weaveworld, and he did a book called The Scarlet Gospels, which was a sequel to The Hellbound Heart, but that one seemed to be much more influenced by the movies than the first book. And in that one, it seemed like Clive Barker himself kind of missed the point, because he made hell more of the traditional Judeo-Christian hell, where Lucifer is actually a character in the Scarlet Gospels. Now, I still like the book for the most part, but still, it's like he kind of missed the point of his own work. Have you read Scarlet Gospels?
I have not. I mean, I've read a lot of reviews of it, and it got very good reviews, but having heard what you've just said about it, I mean, that's kind of disappointing to me, because I always thought that Clive Barker had his own vision, was doing his own thing, and wasn't really sort of paying attention to, the sort of, like I said, the cliches or the expected. He always did things that were unexpected. So that's a little disheartening to hear.
I will say the interesting thing about it is it also brings back Clive Barker's character of Harry Dumar from his short story The Last Illusion, and which was made into the movie Lord of Illusions. So it was kind of cool seeing Harry Dumar go up against Pinhead.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, because I love Lord of Illusions. I think that that's an amazing film. So that's cool. That's a nice like kind of crossover.
And Clive Barker also wrote several Hellraiser comics, which are in the continuity of the films, and he actually brings Harry Dumar back in those as well. So I'm wondering if the Hellraiser comics are maybe in continuity with the Lord of Illusions film or something. But he does some interesting things in the comics where Kirsty eventually becomes a Cenobite, and I think Harry Dumar also becomes a Cenobite in that.
Interesting. I remember reading, and this was probably in late 80s, early 90s, I guess, maybe late 80s, is that I think Marvel, they had an adult line called Epic. Their adult line. And I think they put out Hellraiser comics, but they were like anthologies. And those were actually interesting. There was actually, with any anthology, there's going to be good stories and poor stories. But the artwork, I remember, was very, very vivid in those ones. I thought the stories were largely pretty good. And I read maybe like 3 or 4 of the issues. And I thought what they did in that comic book was actually closer to the first film than maybe some of the sequels.
Now, real quick before we leave, I do want to point out that, and apparently this was going to happen because I asked Doug Bradley about this when I met him. Apparently there was actually going to be a Pinhead and Michael Myers crossover that was going to be written by Clive Barker and directed by John Carpenter. Apparently it was going to happen, but the only reason it didn't was because Mustafa Akkad, who at the time owned the rights to the Halloween franchise, did not want it to happen. The whole idea was it was going to be that Pinhead was the one manipulating Michael Myers the whole time. What do you think? What do you think of that? Do you think that could have worked?
I don't know. I mean, I love Carpenter and Barker, so pretty much anything if they were going to do, I would watch it. I guess my worry would be if they would have turned it into a parody or a comedy. Yeah. That's I could see Carpenter's sort of his worldview, his sort of his need to mess to sort of mess with things. I could see him doing that. But I mean, come on, anything that if they were going to team up, I would watch anything they would do.
Yeah, from what Doug Bradley told me, it was going to be a lot more cerebral than your typical, like, a Freddy versus Jason or something. So it would have been really interesting, but yeah, it never came to fruition. Now, apparently there have been some talks of a Hellraiser TV series. I'm honestly not sure how that would work out. Now, at one point, the guy who directed Martyrs was going to direct a Hellraiser movie. I'm not sure if it was going to be a remake or just another sequel, but he apparently was going to do a Hellraiser film, which I think would have been really interesting. Any closing thoughts on the Hellraiser franchise?
I think it started out with so much potential, so much excitement, so many ideas, and unfortunately, I think it needs to go away unless Clive wants to come back and reinvent it in some ways. But I just don't think these sequels have really... They haven't really stuck to the sort of the trailblazing vision that Clive Barker brought to the first one.
Yeah, I pretty much agree.